Jackson Cole didn't expect to die today, but the universe rarely cared about expectations. The sky above him blazed with smoke trails and burning metal as his small freighter spun out of control, alarms screaming in his ears while his fingers flew over the controls, fighting to land on the dense jungle moon below Calvaris, a world known only for poisonous plants, violent storms, and an eerie silence no one could explain. But it was the only option after the pirate ambush left, his ship limping like a wounded animal through space. The freighter slammed into the thick trees with a groan of twisted metal and fire, throwing Jackson hard against the dash before everything went black. And when he woke, hours later, bruised and bleeding, the wreck was silent except for the groan of cooling steel and the buzz of unseen insects. Jackson dragged himself out of the shattered cockpit, grabbing his sidearm and emergency pack, coughing as smoke rolled across the ground. He was alive, but alone, stranded with no working comms, and no idea who might be looking for him, if anyone even knew where he was, though he doubted it. Night fell quickly on Calvaris, a sudden darkness that swallowed light and sound alike, and he moved fast, setting up a makeshift camp beneath a twisted canopy of black and purple leaves, eating tasteless ration cubes while keeping his eyes on the shadows, because something out there was watching him. He could feel it, a presence, not human and not friendly. The next morning he scouted the wreckage, salvaging a pulse rifle from a storage crate and bundling wires for later, when a sharp, high-pitched cry cut through the air, unnatural and filled with pain, and he froze, every instinct screaming, "Don't get involved," but curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, pushed him forward. Moving through dense vines and thorn-covered roots, Jackson followed the sound to a clearing where 4 armored figures surrounded a collapsed form in silver robes, their rifles drawn, their helmets smooth and without eyes, and Jackson recognized the telltale shimmer of cloaked mercenaries, likely hired killers. He didn't know who the figure on the ground was, but he knew what would happen next, so he acted, aiming from behind a fallen log and firing once, then twice, dropping 2 before the others turned, surprised by human interference. The third shot grazed one's shoulder before Jackson rushed in, firing again and rolling for cover as return fire scorched the trees. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but some instincts never died, and with one final burst, the last enemy fell. Breathing hard, Jackson approached the injured figure, who struggled to lift her head, revealing silver markings across deep violet skin and glowing blue eyes, regal even in pain, and she whispered in a language he barely recognized before switching to the translator dialect. "You saved me?" Jackson nodded, unsure what to say, and she tried to stand but collapsed, clearly wounded. He lifted her carefully and carried her back toward the wreck, deciding he couldn't leave her out here, even if it was dangerous. And as he treated her wounds, that night cuts along her ribs, a burn on her leg, she watched him with strange intensity. In the early hours, she finally spoke again, her voice clearer. "I am Aurelia Tai, first daughter of the royal line of Aurelia." Jackson blinked, realizing that wasn't just a title, that she was royalty from one of the most powerful empires in this quadrant, and his stomach sank. Saving a princess wasn't going to make his life easier. She sat up with difficulty and reached for his hand, her expression solemn and strangely serene as she said, "By the ancient law of my people, a life saved in mortal danger binds 2 souls together. Jackson frowned, already not liking where this was going, and she finished. "You have saved the crown heir of Virelia, and now you must marry me." He stared at her, stunned, not even sure if she was joking, but her face held no humor, only certainty, and outside the shelter, the jungle shifted again, reminding him that danger hadn't passed, and whatever came next was going to be a whole lot stranger than a crash landing. Jackson Cole sat beside the small fire he had built with scraps from his wrecked ship, staring across at the alien princess who now claimed she was his fiancée by law of her people. And though his ribs still hurt and his clothes were scorched from battle, that single sentence echoed louder in his head than any gunshot. Princess Aurela Tai, heir to the Virelian Empire, didn't look like someone who joked, and her steady gaze made it clear she meant every word. Jackson, however, had no intention of marrying anyone, especially not someone from a culture he barely understood, and while she rested, wrapped in a thermal blanket, he paced near the edge of their jungle shelter, trying to think of a way to convince her that humans didn't do things like that, especially after meeting someone less than a day ago. When morning came, the jungle was quiet but heavy with fog, and the silence put Jackson on edge, like something was listening. Aurela moved slowly, still injured, but insisted on helping gather supplies, proving she wasn't just a royal ornament, but someone used to hardship. And while Jackson respected that, it didn't solve the bigger problem mercenaries were after. Her, she was the key to an empire, and now he was tied to her by a vow he never agreed to. During their walk through the undergrowth, she explained that her family had ruled Virelia for centuries, and an internal power struggle had erupted after rumors of the emperor's illness, with Aurela targeted by enemies hoping to claim the throne before the succession could be made official. And Jackson realized just how deep he was in. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a political war, and he was now a piece on someone else's chessboard. Still, he couldn't bring himself to abandon her, not after what he saw in her eyes, something proud but also tired, like she had seen too much for someone her age. They continued moving through the jungle toward the old Virelian relay tower Aurela had mentioned, which might still hold a working beacon to call for help, and Jackson kept his rifle ready, watching every shadow. By midday, they found the broken remains of what had once been a graceful tower of light and crystal, now cracked and buried beneath vines, but Aurela's fingers lit up as she touched a hidden panel, activating something beneath the surface that flickered to life with a soft hum. As she worked, Jackson guarded the perimeter, the uneasy feeling in his gut growing stronger, and when a branch cracked behind him, he spun and fired without hesitation, just missing a scout cloaked in shimmering camouflage who dove for cover more. Mercenaries, and this time better prepared. The next moments were chaos, with plasma bolts tearing through trees and Jackson dragging Aurela behind a stone wall as she clutched a glowing data chip from the beacon's interface, saying it had worked. Her people would hear her signal if they could survive long enough. Jackson improvised, triggering an old fuel cell to explode near the attackers, buying them time to run deeper into the forest. But Aurela was weakening again, the wound on her leg reopening, and Jackson had to carry her as they reached a rocky ridge overlooking a ravine glowing with bioluminescent mist. They climbed down slowly, hiding beneath an overhang while rain began to fall in steady sheets, and in the quiet she looked at him, her voice soft but firm. asking why he had saved her back in the clearing, why a stranger would risk his life for someone he didn't know, and Jackson had no good answer. Maybe it was instinct, maybe habit from his old Marine days, maybe just human decency, but whatever it was, he had no regrets. Aurelia nodded, and for the first time since they met, she smiled, not out of duty or ceremony, but something real, and Jackson felt something shift between them, something unspoken. Later, as night fell and the sounds of predators echoed in the distance, they took shelter beneath a massive fallen tree, and Jackson finally told her he couldn't marry her, not just because of her customs, but because he was a broken man from a broken world, a cargo pilot with a busted ship and a past full of regrets, not a prince or a hero. Just someone trying to survive, yet Aurelia didn't seem upset, only curious, and she explained that Varillian customs didn't require love at first, only honor, and that what she saw in him wasn't weakness, but strength her people had forgotten. Jackson didn't know how to respond, so he stayed quiet as she slept, guarding the camp until the low rumble of engines echoed through the jungle again. It was too soon for a rescue, and the sound didn't match royal ships. A dark shape descended from the clouds, sleek and deadly, and Jackson raised his rifle, his jaw tight, realizing they had been tracked again, and this time escape wouldn't come easy. Jackson crouched behind a thick root wall, gripping his plasma, rifle tightly, as the enemy dropship touched down just beyond the trees, its sleek black frame humming with power, and he could already see figures spilling out from the sides, mercenaries in full armor, helmets with glowing visors, rifles ready, moving with sharp coordination as they swept the jungle. And Jackson knew this was no search party, but a kill team sent to end the chase for good. Beside him, Princess Aurelia breathed heavily, still weak from her reopened wound, but her eyes were focused and fearless, her royal bearing unbroken even in the mud and shadows, and she clutched the data chip close to her chest like it was her last tie to her people. Jackson looked at her and then back at the enemy, knowing they were outnumbered, outgunned, and had nowhere to run, so they'd have to fight, not for victory, but to buy time, maybe to make a difference. He scanned the clearing and spotted a fallen satellite dish half buried in vines, its inner circuits still faintly glowing, and an idea came to him, risky, reckless, but maybe just enough. He whispered the plan to Aurelia, who nodded without hesitation, trusting him completely now, which only made Jackson more determined not to let her die here. He moved fast, crawling through the undergrowth toward the dish while Aurelia stayed, low and silent, clutching a small sidearm he had given her earlier. The mercenaries advanced slowly, sweeping the jungle with motion scanners, unaware of Jackson's presence until he reached the dish, pulled free a power coil, and rerouted its charge into the jungle floor, then threw a piece of metal to draw. Attention! 2 mercs moved to investigate, and as soon as they stepped into the trap zone, Jackson triggered the coil, releasing a sudden electric burst that knocked them flat, shorting their gear and giving him the chance to strike 3 shots. Precise and fast, and they were down. The others reacted instantly, alarms flaring, but now they knew someone was here, and their formation broke, some firing wildly into the trees while others flanked left, trying to surround the area. Jackson ran back to Aurelia, ducking between branches as shots scorched the air behind him, and when he reached her, She had already taken cover behind a stone ledge, waiting for him. He tossed her a second energy cell, reloaded, and together they moved deeper into the ravine, the glow from the bioluminescent mist giving the entire jungle an eerie blue light that danced off their skin and weapons like something from a dream or a nightmare. Jackson found higher ground and took position, picking off another 2 enemies who strayed too far from the group. But the rest were getting smarter, using drones to scan and pressure them from above. Suddenly, a drone buzzed overhead and locked onto Aurella's location, and Jackson had seconds to act. He jumped from his perch, tackled the drone mid-air, and crashed hard to the ground, rolling to his feet just in time to shoot it down before it could alert the others. Aurela was already moving again, and Jackson followed, pain lancing through his shoulder, but adrenaline pushing him forward. Soon they reached an old cave opening carved into the ridge, half hidden by vines, and Jackson knew it was their best shot. He guided Aurela inside, firing one last volley to slow their pursuers. And then they slipped into the dark, the noise of the jungle fading behind them. The cave was narrow and damp, lit only by faint glowworms on the ceiling, and the deeper they went, the quieter it got until even their footsteps echoed like distant thunder. Jackson took the lead, one hand on the wall, the other on his rifle, and behind him Aurela followed without complaint, despite her injuries. They finally reached a small chamber where ancient carvings covered the walls, symbols of Virelian origin. Aurela said, and this place must have once been a watch point for royal scouts, long abandoned but still intact. While she activated a hidden panel to check for supplies or signals, Jackson checked their weapons. 1 working rifle, a weak pistol, and 3 charges left between them. Not good odds, but better than nothing. As they rested, Jackson asked her why the mercenaries were so desperate to kill her rather than take her hostage, and her answer chilled him, because if she lived, she could claim the throne by blood. But if she died, the usurper's claim would go unchallenged, and it would all be over. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of that truth pressing down on both of them, and then Jackson stood, pacing, thinking, planning, because hiding wouldn't save them forever, and help might not arrive in time. Then the worst happened. One of the mercenaries had found their heat trail, and soon the sound of metal boots echoed through the cave entrance, slow and careful, but getting closer. Jackson motioned for Aurela to stay hidden and moved to intercept, setting a trap with one of the last energy cells near a bend in the tunnel. And when the first enemy rounded the corner, the blast knocked him off his feet. Jackson finished the job with a well-aimed shot, but now the others knew where they were. The cave became a battlefield of light and noise as the mercs stormed in, and Jackson fought like a cornered wolf, his shots precise, his movements fast, while Aurela provided cover fire when needed, her royal training finally showing itself as she took down one of the intruders with a perfect headshot. It wasn't enough to stop them all, but it was enough to delay just enough, because at the very moment Jackson thought they were finished, a high-pitched signal echoed through the cave, followed by a sudden blast of wind and a new light from the entrance. Virelian loyalist troops had arrived, responding to Aurela's beacon at last, and they came in full force, overwhelming the mercenaries and securing the area within minutes. Jackson collapsed against the cave wall, breathing hard, covered in grime and blood, but still alive, And when Aurilla knelt beside him, smiling with relief, he allowed himself a moment to relax until one of the Verelian captains approached, saluted Aurilla, and delivered terrible news. Her father, the Emperor, was dead, the palace seized, and Verelia was now under the control of the usurper. Jackson looked at Aurilla, whose smile faded slowly, replaced by a quiet, cold determination, and he realized the fight had only just begun. The royal ship soared through the stars in silence, its sleek silver hull cutting through the void as Jackson Cole stood near the wide observation window, watching the distant glow of Kelvaris shrink behind them, its deadly jungle finally left behind. But the unease in his chest only grew stronger because ahead of them was not safety, but a world he could barely understand, a world of crowns, power, and alien politics where he was just a human, a stranger in every sense, and now tied by a bond he didn't ask for to a woman whose destiny could shake entire empires. Beside him, Princess Aurelitai stood tall, her robes cleaned and repaired, though her legs still bore signs of the battle they had barely survived, and her eyes held a cold edge now. The fire of royalty fully awakened after the news of her father's death. No more hesitation, no more hiding. The Verelian fleet had answered her signal, but the response had come too late to save the throne. And now her people waited in secret exile aboard hidden warships and deep space stations, watching their empire fall into the hands of Lord Trovan. Her cousin, the one who had declared himself regent after the Emperor's sudden illness, and now controlled the capital. Jackson had no interest in being part of a civil war between stars, but he knew too much now, had done too much to walk away, and every time he tried to say he should leave, Aurilla simply looked at him with that unreadable gaze, the same one she'd used when declaring their bond back on the moon, and he stayed silent. When the ship docked with a hidden station orbiting a dead world, Jackson followed her through long crystal halls, lined with guards in royal armor, their stares cool and suspicious, and he could feel the weight of his difference, the way his human frame and simple clothes stood out in a sea of shimmering uniforms and perfectly ordered military precision. In the council chamber, nobles and commanders stood in a wide circle around a glowing map of the empire, arguing in quick Verelian dialects, some shouting for retaliation, others demanding retreat, and Jackson felt like a ghost in the room until one voice called out sharply, pointing at him, an older noble, tall and sharp-eyed, demanding to know why a human outsider stood beside the heir like an equal. Aurilla didn't flinch as she stepped forward and said with clear force that Jackson was the one who saved her life, defended her from assassins, carried her across Kelvaris, and stood by her when no one else could, and by the ancient bond. He was now her chosen. The room fell into stunned silence, some horrified, others simply confused, and Jackson wanted to speak, to explain that this wasn't his choice, but Aurilla raised a hand gently, and he stayed quiet. Later, in her chambers, Jackson finally asked why she insisted on keeping him by her side, and Aurilla answered simply that trust was rare among rulers, and trust earned through fire could not be thrown away lightly. As the days passed aboard the station, Jackson trained with her soldiers, learned their customs, their weapons, their tactics, and even though he remained an outsider, some of them began to respect him, not for his past, but for what he had done in the jungle, for the way he never backed down. Still, whispers followed him wherever he went of the human who would stand beside the next empress, of the man who walked unafraid through alien halls, and of what it would mean if the old bond law was truly honored. Everything changed when Aurela received word of a secret meeting being held in the city world of Valkaris, where Trollvin's generals were gathering, unguarded, to plan the final move that would crush the resistance, and she saw an opportunity not to destroy them, but to steal something far more dangerous, the Imperial Seal, the ancient device that could activate royal protocols and rally loyal fleets still hiding in deep space. Aurela proposed a daring infiltration mission, and to Jackson's shock, she named him as one of the 3 who would go with her, disguised as diplomats from a neutral system. The plan was dangerous, nearly suicidal, but it was the only way to turn the tide, and Jackson agreed, partly because of duty, partly because of her, and partly because he was tired of being dragged along by fate. This time, he wanted to walk into the fire on his own terms. When they arrived on Valkaris, the city world spun below them like a jewel of light and towers with layers of walkways, airborne traffic, and floating plazas. And as they stepped into the diplomatic district, dressed in borrowed robes and carrying forged identities, Jackson kept one hand near his hidden pistol, watching every shadow. Inside the palace, Aurela walked like she belonged, calm and unreadable, while Jackson scanned every guard, every noble, every camera, feeling the tension in his spine grow tighter with each step. They reached the vault holding the Imperial Seal. Just as the alarms began to sound, someone had discovered their false credentials, and everything exploded into chaos. Jackson drew his pistol and shot the first guard before the man could raise his rifle, and Aurela moved like lightning, disabling the next with a precise strike to the neck. And then the 3rd crew member, a quiet Virelian named Koresh, used a sonic pulse to break the vault seal just as backup arrived. Jackson grabbed the seal and shoved it into Aurela's hands, covering her as they ran through corridors of flame and light, hunted by palace security and Trollvin's private guards, who now knew exactly who had dared to enter the lion's den. They escaped by diving through a rooftop landing bay and stealing a courier ship, blasting into the sky under fire, and as the stars swallowed them again, Jackson slumped into a seat, panting, staring at the seal that now glowed with living light. In Aurela's hands, this small object, this ancient piece of technology, could change the fate of billions, and he had helped steal it. As the ship returned to the hidden station, Jackson realized he had crossed a line he could never step back from. He wasn't just involved anymore. He was part of this war, a human among empires, and though he didn't know where it would end, he knew one thing for certain. The next time they returned to Varelia, it would be as challengers, and either Aurela claim her throne, or they would both die trying. Jackson Cole stood at the edge of the command deck, watching the stars flicker past as the royal fleet prepared for war, his thoughts a storm of doubt and beauty as every ship powered up weapons and shields, preparing to answer the call of the Imperial Seal, which now sat secure in a crystal vault at the heart of Aurela Tai's flagship, pulsing softly like a living heart. The seal had done its job, waking old protocols and summoning forgotten fleets from deep space hiding, and for the first time since the coup, the rebellion had teeth-real, sharp, steel-forged ships with loyal captains ready to fight for the Tanba rightful heir. But even with this power rising, Jackson felt like a man standing in a firestorm, unsure whether to run or stay, and the title others whispered behind his back. The reluctant prince only made it worse. He hadn't chosen this life, hadn't asked to be bonded by ancient laws to an alien princess, hadn't asked to be part of a royal court where every glance held secrets and every word carried the weight of power. Yet somehow here he was, and with every passing day the idea of leaving grew harder, not because of duty or law, but because of Aurela herself. She had changed since their time in the jungle, grown colder to her enemies but warmer to him in private, and their bond, whatever it truly meant, seemed to deepen with each shared danger, though neither of them spoke of it directly, not yet. Now, with war at the edge of every breath, Aurela called a council aboard the flagship, summoning commanders, advisors, and Jackson, who entered the great hall with eyes following him from every corner, half curious, half wary. The plan was simple, in words but impossible in scale. They would strike the capital directly before Trelvan could fully fortify it, using surprise and loyalty from within the palace guard to open a breach, allowing Aurela and her chosen strike team to reach the throne chamber and reclaim control while the fleet kept Trelvan's ships busy in orbit. But it hinged on one thing: Jackson would have to lead a second team into the palace's central core and disable the defense grid from within. A suicide mission even by Virelian standards, but Jackson didn't flinch as he accepted, because deep inside something had shifted. He no longer saw himself as an outsider, but as someone who had a place in this fight, even if he still didn't fully understand why. Aurela caught him alone later, in the quiet of the starlight corridor, and asked softly if he truly wanted to do this, not out of obligation, but because he believed in the cause. And Jackson gave a small nod, saying only that he believed in her, which made something flicker in her expression, something unspoken. On the eve of battle, the fleet gathered like a silver storm around the shadow of Virelia Prime, its many rings and cities spinning in artificial gravity, glowing with power but also rotting from within under Trelvan's rule. And as the first strike ships launched in silence, the final stage began. Jackson's team entered the city through a maintenance port opened by double agents in the guard, and once inside they split off in 3 groups, each one tasked with disabling a key system. Jackson's group had to reach the shield matrix, buried beneath the royal gardens, but as they advanced, alarms flared, and it became clear their timing had been betrayed. Drones and elite guards moved faster than expected, cutting them off, and Jackson found himself separated, leading only 2 Virelians: Koresh, the silent technician, and Elira, a sharp-eyed scout who didn't trust him but followed orders without question as they ducked through broken halls and echoing tunnels, trying to reach the core before the fleet's window closed. They moved like ghosts, hiding in old aqueducts and forgotten passageways, while above the city trembled from orbital fire as Aurela's ships engaged the loyalist fleets, and Jackson's heart pounded not from fear, but from purpose. He had never felt this alive, this driven, even on Earth, even in the military, because this wasn't just survival, it was a mission that meant something. They finally reached the Matrix chamber, but it was guarded 2 heavy turrets, a squad of elite sentries, and a security system that could fry them on entry, and Jackson had seconds to decide. He whispered a plan, split them up, and threw a smoke beacon as he charged forward. drawing fire while Illyra disabled the turret controls, and Koresh hacked the main gate. And though plasma scorched past his shoulder and burned his armor, Jackson held his ground until the gate cracked open, and they dove inside. Koresh began disabling the matrix, fingers flying over alien keys while alarms screamed, and Jackson and Illyra held the door, trading fire with the advancing guards until Koresh shouted it was done. The shields were down. Now it was up to Aurela. As the enemy forced them back into the chamber, Jackson prepared for the end. But instead of death, he saw a sudden flash, and Aurela herself stormed in with her strike team, having taken a different path when her own route was blocked. And the battle turned in an instant. Together they fought their way through the final corridor toward the throne chamber, where Trelvin waited with his personal guard, a tall figure in silver armor and a crown he had no right to wear. The final battle was brutal, close quarters, and desperate, with plasma bursts lighting the gold-tiled walls and sword strikes ringing through the high air, and Jackson found himself facing Trelvin directly as Aurela dueled the man second. Trelvin sneered at the sight of a human standing before him, calling Jackson a pet dragged into royal games. But Jackson didn't answer. He simply raised his rifle and fired, not to kill, but to knock the tyrant off balance, just long enough for Aurela to land the final blow and bring him to his knees. Silence fell in the chamber as the remaining guards stood down, and Aurela stepped forward, placing her hand on the sealed throne, which lit up beneath her palm, recognizing her blood, her right, her fire, and just like that, Virelia was hers again. As loyalists poured into the palace and began securing the city, Jackson stood beside her in the throne room, armor scorched, eyes tired but alive, and Aurela turned to him with quiet pride, then did something that stunned everyone she took. His hand lifted it before the court, and said that though he came from another world, he had stood as one of them, fought as one of them, and now would remain as her bondmate and war prince. Not by law alone, but by choice. The court murmured, some in shock, others in approval, and Jackson said nothing for a long moment, then gave a small smile, knowing there was no going back now. Not for him, not for her, and certainly not for the galaxy watching everything change. Sun of Virelia Prime rose slowly over the shining towers of the capital, casting golden light across the grand plaza where thousands gathered in silence, watching the final ceremony that would seal the fate of an empire, and Jackson Cole stood at the edge of it all, dressed in formal armor lined with silver threads, his heart pounding louder than the ceremonial drums echoing through the air. Because while the world watched a new empress rise, he stood at a crossroads, a place between duty and destiny, wondering if a human like him truly had a place in a world of ancient stars, immortal legacies, and rulers born from blood and tradition. Across from him, Princess No, Empress Aurela stood tall at the steps of the Star Throne, her long dark robes flowing behind her like a shadow wrapped in light, her expression calm and unreadable, though her eyes searched his more than once, and Jackson knew this day was more than a coronation. It was the final test of what their strange bond had become, forged in jungle fire, sharpened by war, and sealed by victory in a city that had nearly killed them both. After the defeat of Trelvin, Aurela had moved swiftly, using the seal to reawaken old systems, rally distant fleets, and bring peace to the divided empire. and most of the nobles who once doubted her now stood behind her with quiet loyalty. But their eyes often slid toward Jackson when they thought she wasn't looking, as if waiting to see what this earthborn man would do next, what choice he would make now that the fight was over. The people called him Starblade, the warrior who helped the true heir return, and some even whispered he was to become consort, bound by both ancient law and choice, though no such vow had been spoken aloud, not yet, and that silence was louder than any trumpet or fanfare, because Jackson himself wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. He had saved Aurella, fought beside her, almost died for her, and yet the thought of wearing a crown next to hers felt unreal, like a dream he hadn't asked for, and part of him wondered if Earth still remembered him at all, or if he was just a ghost now lost to the stars. But time had run out, and now the High Priestess of Virelia lifted the imperial circlet, the thin golden crown passed down from ruler to ruler for thousands of years, and began the final words of the coronation, her voice ringing across the plaza and through the crystal towers. And with each line, Aurella stepped closer to the throne, until finally she stood before it, her hand raised, and Jackson's breath caught, because before she could take her seat, she turned around to face the people and called his name, clear and strong, silencing the crowd in an instant. She spoke not as ruler, but as the woman who had crossed a deadly moon with him, who had trusted him when all others questioned his place, and she asked him, publicly, boldly, if he would stand beside her, not as a symbol, not because of law or obligation, but as her equal, not bound by force, but by choice. Jackson felt every eye on him, every breath paused, the future of an empire waiting for a simple word, and in that moment he saw not just the crown or the people, but the journey Aurella's fierce eyes in the jungle, her steady hands on the starship's controls, her voice calming his fear before battle, her anger when he was hurt, her smile when they stood alone watching the stars, and he realized something simple but powerful. It wasn't about crowns or war or empires. It was about her and the life they had built in the fire. Slowly he stepped forward, one step, then another, until he reached her side, and though he said nothing, he simply nodded once, and the priestess smiled, stepping back as Aurella took the final step and placed the crown upon her own head, not needing anyone to do it for her, a sign of her strength and will. And as she sat upon the star throne, the Empire's systems recognized her rule, light cascading from the throne's base in spiraling patterns that shot into the sky and lit the entire city with a soft golden glow. The crowd erupted into cheers, and yet Jackson barely heard them, because Aurella reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. And though he still wasn't sure what title he would carry, he knew he would walk this path beside her. In the days that followed, Aurella moved quickly to restore balance across the Empire, sending relief fleets to damaged worlds, pardoning those who had been forced into service under Trovan, and rebuilding alliances that had nearly broken under pressure. But the greatest surprise came when she formed a new council, one that included humans for the first time, sending a signal across the galaxy that the old ways were changing, that the Virilian Empire would not stand above the rest, but beside them. And Jackson, though uncomfortable in halls of politics and heavy robes, used his unique view to bridge the gap between Earth and Virelia, working with diplomats and scientists to open peaceful exchange between their worlds, a dream once thought impossible. But even with peace blooming, danger still lurked in deep space. Whispers of distant empires who feared Varelia's return, and the strange human who now stood at the heart of its power. One night, as Jackson stood alone on the balcony, overlooking the endless lights of the capital, Aurelia joined him, silent for a moment before speaking of her visions of threats beyond the mapped stars, of unknown forces watching, waiting, and of a future where their bond would be tested not by war, but by something even greater. She asked him again, not as ruler, but as the woman who had fought beside him, if he was still ready to walk this path, even if it led to galaxies uncharted. And Jackson, staring into the stars, answered simply that he had never known what his place in the universe was, but now, standing beside her, he felt like he had found it. And so, under the light of 1,000 stars, an empress and her chosen stood together, not as legend, but as truth, not as rulers alone, but as two people who had turned survival into strength, fear into purpose, and a chance meeting on a deadly moon into a future that stretched far beyond the edge of any map, a future where anything was possible.